Hey there, Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen, leading the movement for movement and bringing you another edition of Autism Fitness Tuesday Training, the informational roller coaster / library that enhances and optimizes your fitness and adapted PE programs for the autism and neurodivergent population. That was, if nothing else, a run-on sentence. And before we get started, definitely please subscribe, and in the comments below, let me know what you're getting out of these videos, if you're applying some of the concepts, practices, if it's changed your philosophy or your approach to the autism and neurodivergent population. And of course, if there's a subject that you want me to cover in a future edition of Tuesday Training, leave that in the comments below too, because quite honestly, I want to know. It helps me, it helps the channel, and of course it helps you if I'm covering a topic that makes sense, that is relevant to what you are doing. So in this edition of Autism Fitness Tuesday Training, I was thinking about what have I not covered here, at least in a while, and I spun the mental wheel: core training. All right. What is the core? It comes up, that word, oftentimes when we talk about some of the physiological deficits for the autism population. It comes up a lot in physical therapy, occupational therapy literature, now more in fitness talk. And historically, I've spoken with a lot of parents and families, and one of the number one concerns is core strength. So core strength coincides a lot with this diagnosis of low tone, which I refer to as a catch-all term. And many individuals with autism, particularly kids, are diagnosed with low tone, which, as I mentioned, is a catch-all phrase, which kind of means that there are gross motor deficits. But then, in order to make it usable and relevant and purposeful for us in practice, whether we are coaches or therapists or educators, or even family members who are so intrepid to implement fitness programs in the home, we have to decide what that means and observe what it's going to look like with reference to each particular movement pattern. So when we say gross motor, this is general, and we want to narrow it down to what does it look like in the fundamental movement patterns. And what I mean by that, of course, are our pushes and our pulls and our squats and our carries, and how does it cross over to locomotion. So when we consider this from the perspective of the big movement patterns, again, squatting, so mainly using the posterior chain, pushing, pulling, carrying, where does core strength come into that? Now let's talk about the core. Now, the core as a terminology in the fitness world, at least, came to prominence in around the early to mid 1990s, when core training became a big trend. And historically, and there are some fascinating books about this, I highly recommend, if you can find it, Muscle, Smoke, and Mirrors, which is a history of physical culture in America all throughout the 1800s, 1900s. Fascinating read if you can find a copy, but I digress here. So core training became kind of trendy, and there were some good things that came out of it. And as always in the fitness industry, there are some absolutely ridiculous things that came out, some of which, or several of which, still persist today, and they have kind of crept into what we would call training or even therapy for the autism and neurodivergent population. And some of this involves laying on or rolling around on a stability ball, for example, which is not really core training. It's more passive than anything. And core training, what people are usually referring to or thinking about, is the transverse abdominis, or the six-pack muscles, which is the anterior portion of the midsection of the body. But the core is there to flex and extend and stabilize in a variety of different situations. So how do we make this applicable, safe, and effective for the autism and neurodivergent population in our training program? So number one, there's definitely some things that we want to incorporate to strengthen and engage stabilization of the core, and some things that simply either don't work or don't make sense or are potentially dangerous. So let's talk about first some of the things that work. So my favorite exercises, especially when we are working with those prototypical athletes from a physiological perspective who may have been diagnosed with low tone or are sufficiently detrained, meaning they have never had a physical fitness program, they are often sedentary, and they have either lost what initial strength they developed as a child just in growth and development or playing around or being physically active, and that has steadily declined, and now we have a rather weak core, right? So we're talking about that transverse abdominis, but that's not all. We're also talking about, well, when we talk about the midsection, we're also talking about the obliques. We can even add in the low back to that as well, because the core isn't just one muscle group, it's several muscle groups acting again in different ways to stabilize and provide strength through different movement patterns. So we have to look at it movement by movement as well. So we're not just talking about, oh, let's get the transverse abdominis, these six-pack muscles, dogs invading, these six-pack muscles strong so that it carries over to other activities, because it doesn't necessarily work that way. So my favorite go-to exercises for engaging the core or the abdominals for our autism and neurodivergent athletes are our heavy carries and our push-ups. Oftentimes with push-ups, we are doing a modification of that movement pattern because the athlete is not yet able to safely and effectively move through that full range and stabilize. But if we look at a plank, which is a very popular abdominal exercise and not a particularly great one at that, I'll get into that in a minute. A push-up is a moving plank that also involves a fantastic chest and tricep and even shoulder stimulus. And for those of our athletes who have difficulty with grip and hand strength, there's another one. There's definitely a grip and hand strength component to a push-up. Way, and that is technical way, more value than just a plank. Planks are popular, but the reality is it's an isometric contraction, which when compared to an eccentric contraction and a concentric contraction, the isometric contraction falls way below those as far as training effect. And then heavy carries. Heavy carries are a fantastic way to incorporate the core in an exercise that has direct transference or carryover into activities of daily living, which of course is the goal for all of our life skill athletes, to develop strength and mover and motor patterns that transcend the gym or the fitness program or wherever you're running your adapted PE or fitness programs, and actually enhance that individual's ability to perform in daily life. That is the platinum standard right there. So let's talk about push-up variations. And of course, a lot of our athletes may not just start out with a straight or even a slightly inclined push-up. We have modifications for that. That's what the Autism Fitness certification will teach you, among many, many other things. And then we have our heavy carries. And of course, if you have the room and the equipment to do so, our sled pushes and sled drags are fantastic ways to stabilize the trunk when performing a locomotive movement. The other one I would go to as well is a standing band row. There is a major trunk stability component to doing a good standing band row. Now, some of the exercises that we don't employ, and with very, very good reason, exercises like sit-ups and crunches, which are not inherently bad. But, and this is a generalization, but we have to do so for the sake of this conversation, when you have an athlete who has, number one, low tone or is significantly detrained, they are not regularly performing physical exercise, and they have deficits in kinesthetic awareness and motor planning, Something like a sit up or a crunch is simply a bad idea. I don't know how to make that any more clear, because what happens, and I have seen this over and over and over again, is the athlete starts to crane or flex their neck, and they move up, they flex really quickly, and they bypass by through sheer speed and force, they bypass any good contraction of the abdominals. So they push themselves up really quick, and we get all low back and neck and miss everything in the actual core. So just adding crunches or sit-ups is usually a bad idea, especially when our athlete cannot stabilize and perform the movement with motor control, right? Through that healthy range of motion. And for those of you working in or going to a gym, I challenge you with this. If you're looking around watching people do crunches on the floor or sit-ups, watch someone who's not actually moving their neck and flexing it back and forward. I challenge you, because most people are doing a neck crunch more than they are actually doing any type of abdominal work. And if they are doing abdominal work, then they're doing it in a very short range. So they might feel a slight contraction in the abs, but it's definitely not a full healthy range of motion, and you're not getting optimal stimulation or muscular contraction in definitely not the eccentric and probably not the concentric part of the movement as well. Again, an exercise is a tool, and the way that we set that exercise up, the way that we progress or modify it, and particularly the way that we coach it, is going to be absolutely critical in that training effect for that athlete. So if you have an athlete, now this is autism, neurodivergent, or neurotypical, who does not have the motor control and the stability yet to be able to perform that sit-up or that crunch with good form, then that exercise does not make sense for them right now. And no amount of let's just do more reps or let's do this as fast as possible is going to provide any further benefit. It's not. So when we're talking about core training, particularly again for the autism and neurodivergent population, of course, we want to assess our athlete first to understand what their capabilities are. But there's a reason why there are some exercises that are going to be way more useful in the majority of situations than others. Again, our heavy carries, push-up variations, row variations are going to get a lot more stabilization of the core, at least in the short term. Our farmer's walks are definitely going to get a contraction in not only the anterior, but the posterior, because the core, again, the abdominals are not just in the front, right? If we're talking about the core, it's this tube in the center of the body, if we want to think about it that way. So it's not just the sit-up crunchy exercises. Again, not bad, but often misused, and we don't want to get into a situation where there is the liability of injury because the exercise does not make sense for that particular athlete. So, in closing, core training is not just the anterior or that six-pack area, much as, I don't know, pop fitness culture wants us to believe or demonstrates or whatever it is. I don't even think that it's a conspiracy of sorts. I think it just has been watered down a little bit, and more of an understanding about how it's actually going to impact our life skill athletes. What exercises are also going to incorporate core strengthening and stabilization that shows up in a variety of beneficial ways in their actual life. And the last point that I'll make is, if we are talking about core training for aesthetic reasons as well, Yes, there is certainly additional exercise that we want to incorporate there. But ultimately, a lot of that comes down to nutrition as well. And this is something that still pervades is you can do as many crunches or as many sit-ups as you can in a session. There still needs to be some adherence to nutrition that makes sense. Caloric intake, macronutrients, those kinds of things, which is beyond the scope of this video, right? But that's important as well. So just doing 100 crunches is not going to spot reduce adipose tissue in that region. It's just not. Been demonstrated many times. So it's a combination. The exercise, the nutrition, the healthy habits, a well-rounded active lifestyle, right? Bit of a veering off, but I wanted to add that in because it is a common question. So we need the fitness component and the nutrition component as well. And as far as core training, initially with many of our athletes, because of those both kinesthetic awareness deficits in how do I move my body, and also the detraining or the untrained and now beginning athlete, we want to stay with the push-up, the row, the carry as our main exercises that are going to incorporate some core training. And at least in the short term, stay away from the sit-ups and crunches, not because they are horrendously bad, dangerous exercises, but because with 20 plus years of practice, I can tell you that they are highly unlikely to be viable choices or beneficial choices for the majority of our athletes. And it's going to be a lot of neck flexion versus actually contracting the abdominals in a beneficial way. I hope that helps clear up things about the core. I'm Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen, leading the movement for movement. If you want to know much more about not only the exercises to use, but how to program and create a structure that'll work for any athlete, then it's time for you to become an Autism Fitness Certified Pro. If this video has been helpful for you, definitely add a comment below. And if there is a topic that you'd like me to cover in a future video, definitely add that to the list down here. Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen, leading the movement for movement. Thank you for watching this edition of Autism Fitness Tuesday Training.